Hi, I'm Brian Kavanaugh. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the Virtual Visiting Professor Network. Today's guest speaker is Dr. Malika Siker from the Medical College of Wisconsin. A brief word about the VVPN. It is intended to be a network for sharing educational presentations across the field of radiation oncology and beyond. Everyone is welcome, especially residents in radiation oncology. The network will be headed by Dr. Kaylee Doak. Many of you know her as the former chair of the Association for Residents in Radiation Oncology. She's also the co-founder of the Society for Women in Radiation Oncology. Ideally, there will be a community that emerges with a representative from each training program, either the program director or a chief resident, to participate in future speaker selection. Please email Kaylee to join, and please follow @RadOncVVPN on Twitter for announcements of upcoming presentations. Dr. Malika Siker is probably quite well known to most of you. She has a big presence on social media and a large following. She is currently the Associate Dean of Student Inclusion and Diversity at the Medical College of Wisconsin. She's also an Associate Professor in the Department of Radiation Oncology there. She currently chairs Astro's Committee for Healthcare Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion, also called CHEDI, and she is the Associate Senior Editor for Advances for Radiation Oncology. She has many, many other wonderful accomplishments on her CV, too numerous to mention here. What you might not know about Dr. Siker is that she is a linguist. She has spent time both in Spain and in Paris studying abroad during her undergraduate years. I think, as you'll hear from her presentation, she is from a family that represents all the best elements of the wonderful cultural melting pot that is the United States of America. She was given a very prestigious award by the Milwaukee Business Journal, the 40 Under 40 designation last year. She's also won many other local and national awards. I particularly point out the Milwaukee Award because in addition to her national presence, she has a very important role in civic actions around Milwaukee. She has supported many important community causes there, and you'll hear a little bit about that also in the talk. One last thing, she is an absolute expert karaoke singer. I don't know how she does it, but she seems to know all lyrics to all songs without even reading the words. She's a wonderful person to hang out with. I hope you get to know her IRL in the future. But without further ado, let me present to you Dr. Malika Siker.
One of the things that's been on my mind is, with all of the uncertainty that's in the world right now, how we can contribute as radiation oncologists. And so the title of the talk is Innovating in Radiation Oncology and Beyond, Dare to Make Your Own Mark. I don't have any disclosures, sadly. How do I hide this screen? Because I can't read my slides now. Okay, there we go. So there's some knowledge objectives. We're going to talk about how my personal life has driven my professional journey. We're going to discuss ways to carve an authentic path, identify opportunities to improve equity in radiation oncology, and recognize challenges in achieving equity in future directions. So after the talk, I hope that you're inspired to have the courage to be your true self, and I want to challenge you to forge your own unique path and find the courage to push yourself out of your own comfort zone. So this is my story. I'm nobody. I don't come from a fancy family or a family of people with really high degrees or anything. My mom is from Indonesia. She's from Jakarta. She's half Indonesian and Chinese, and my dad is Ashkenazi Jewish. And they met in Milton, Wisconsin, which is a tiny town in Wisconsin of all places. And so I grew up in a town called Janesville, Wisconsin, which has got about 50,000 people. And it was just a really, my family story, it's just a really weird mixing of cultures. Even with all my diversity work, I've never met another half Indonesian, half Ashkenazi Jewish person other than my siblings. And it was very enriching to grow up, grandma from, my mom grew up half Muslim, half Christian, and, grandma would come from Indonesia. She'd be praying to Allah in the corner while we'd be lighting Hanukkah candles. And it was a really kind of magical household to grow up in. And I didn't really realize at the time how unique it was. But in many ways I did realize, because for those that know about Janesville, Wisconsin, it's a very homogeneous environment. I was one of the very few, if only, minorities in Janesville. And I think I grew up with a sense of shame. Like I didn't fit in, I looked different than everybody. And even within my own culture, I felt like I didn't belong. And I think I was also really afraid. There was a KKK uprising in Janesville when I was growing up, and the KKK doesn't like Jewish people any more than they like Black people. So, I was always I grew up with a lot of shame and fear. But that changed when I went to undergraduate at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. And I was part of one of these programs that was a combined pre-med and medical school program. And for the first time in my life, I was able to meet a lot of other minority people, the Jewish people, people from all over the world. So for me, Madison seemed like the most diverse place on earth. And in a way, I had some sort of my own coming out where I finally didn't feel afraid to be myself or ashamed. At the same time, Madison was in the news. The guy on the photo, the far right, is my friend Diallo, and they actually cropped his face in a advertising piece for the university. He'd never been to a football game before, and there his face was in the crowd. And so that was sort of the climate in Madison. There was a lot of activism around diversity and inclusion, and I got to be there on campus around the same time. Additionally, I got to spend a year in Paris, where this small town Wisconsin girl got to spend a year in an urban city like Paris, and working there and teaching there was a really fantastic experience. I matriculated into medical school at University of Wisconsin-Madison, and it was like being back in Janesville again. There weren't a lot of minorities, and a lot of the other minority students on campus were really unhappy at the medical school, and it was hard for me to reconcile that I was in the same institution, literally the same apartment, and having these two drastically different experiences. And so we started, I guess at the time we would just, we started to have these events where we connected with other diverse graduate students in the law school, business school, and we'd have these networking events and social events and parties where we'd all come together and sort of create our own diverse community within a place that wasn't diverse. And it was really our administration that empowered us to do so. Our deans and faculty really just sort of gave us the power to do so, and we were able to make things better for ourselves. Additionally, I was a French major in undergraduate, and I got to spend the year in Paris, like I mentioned. But while I was a medical student, there was a visiting professor from Brittany, from Brest, and he was a cystic fibrosis expert. And I was asked by the French department to give him a tour of the campus, which I did. And he invited me to spend some time with him over this summer to do some cystic fibrosis research. And so he was actually there to visit the dean of our medical school. So I actually had the guts, I can't believe I did this, but I actually wrote the dean of the medical school mentioning that I had met his collaborator in France, and would he have a research opportunity for me that summer. And so they actually did have a research opportunity. They were looking for somebody to spend the summer in Europe collecting Celtic remains that they were going to analyze in Dr. Farek, that was the French professor, in his lab to look for cystic fibrosis mutation. The thought was, if you look at the extent of, if you look at the countries with the highest prevalence of cystic fibrosis, particularly the Delta F508 mutation, it sort of looks like the map of the Roman Empire right before it collapsed. And so there was some thought that similar to malaria, similar to being a sickle cell carrier, providing selective advantage for those in countries with malaria, the thought was that there must be some sort of selective advantage for the Delta F508. So the hypothesis was we wanted to find cystic fibrosis mutations in Celtic remains. So I got to spend the summer in Vienna collecting Celtic remains at the Natural History Museum and transported them to a lab in Brest looking for these mutations. So it was a really exciting summer. It didn't even seem real to be a medical student and do a project like that. And I think it taught me a lot about interdisciplinary research. So my dad was diagnosed with cancer during my second year of medical school, and I decided I want to be a radiation oncologist thanks to some peer and faculty mentorship. And so, as you guys know, back in the day, to get into radiation oncology, it was really competitive. And fortunately, I was able to match. And like everybody else, I think I sort of lost myself again in trying to become a radiation oncologist. You guys know the field. It's just, besides targeting the tumor and normal tissue effects, it didn't seem like there was much room for, my other passions like diversity and inclusion and equity. So I put my head down and studied to pass my boards and make it through residency. And I think for me too, I had 3 kids along the way. And I think when you become a mom and start a family, you kind of lose yourself and find yourself at the same time. And so that was also a new adventure. But after coming out of the motherhood fog, my husband and I, we happened to find ourselves with a lot of diverse friends who are doing really cool things in the city around diversity and inclusion and equity. And I sort of discovered around the same time that there were things happening both at my institution and in radiation oncology surrounding diversity, equity, inclusion, and it sort of felt like coming home. And it was a really exciting time. It's been an exciting time to meet up with other colleagues and friends who are dedicated to the same mission. And I have to express a lot of thanks to my leadership. On the left, that's my chair, who's now retired, Dr. Frank Wilson, who sort of blazed a trail for himself in community advocacy and also has strong interests in equity. And my current chair, Chris Schultz, and Vice Chair Colleen Lawton, who have sort of let me do my thing, so to speak, in diversity and inclusion and equity. And I just really appreciate them letting me have space to explore this. So I never in a million years would have dreamt that I would end up being a dean. I honestly still kind of giggle when people call me Dean Siker because it just doesn't seem even really possible that someone with my background could be a dean. And I've been really honored to be the chair now of the Committee for Health Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion, and follow in the footsteps of people like Kurt DeVille and Karen Wingfield, who are really putting diversity, inclusion, and equity on the map in radiation oncology. So lessons that I've learned from my life as reality changes, the problems that you have as an M1 seem like the biggest deal, and then you trade those to M2 and M3 problems, and you graduate, you've got your residency problems, and your reality is constantly changing. So you don't have to, be too stuck in one problem. The other thing is to know your power. There's a lot of people that want to help you if you just ask and connect. And so the easiest way that people give up power is believing they don't have any. So know that you have power and that you can use it. And lastly, don't lose yourself. Oftentimes the parts of yourself that you try to hide because you're ashamed of them can be sometimes the best pieces of yourself. So don't lose yourself along the way, especially as you're studying during your training years. So I'd like to advise to everybody to escape the factory assembly line. It seems like when you're a resident that career options are binary. You can either choose between private practice or academics, or clinical versus research. And maybe if you're really crazy, you'll do something like translational, but career options are not binary. There are other options that exist, in industry. We have Shilpan Patel and Deepak Kuntia who are doing great things in industry. In education, Iris Gibbs and Neha Bapawala are both deans of admissions at their institutions. Entrepreneurship, Kate Deming is doing really cool stuff with her Make Merry line. Hospital leadership, Ted DeWeese is the vice chair of faculty affairs at Johns Hopkins. Journalism, Mimi Knoll has been doing awesome work with her journalism that she's doing for Forbes, and I love reading the stuff that she's putting out right now for COVID. And advocacy, Fumiko Chino, Matt Katz, just really blowing it up in Twitter and elsewhere, being huge advocates for things like financial toxicity. And lastly, of course, government. You can turn on CNN and see a radiation oncologist standing next to the president. So that's pretty cool. So you can do a lot of other things other than just private practice or academics or clinical versus research. And I'm not just saying this because Dr. Scott was part of the group that invited me, but if you haven't seen his TED Talk, you really should. It's 15 minutes long, and I think that he talks a lot about these topics as well in this TED Talk. He talks about his really colorful career path, and that the way that we choose medical students is very flawed. To get into medical school, you have to have very high grades, very high test scores, and there's no room for error. There's no room for people to take risks. And I love this, what he said during his TED Talk, so I transcribed it down. He said, the part of the mind that's responsible for every single transformative leap in all of science ever is the imagination and creativity. And what we've done is taken that part of the brain and thrown it to the side and put a warehouse in its place. And we ask medical students to fill that warehouse with the names of genetic mutations, biochemical pathway cartoons, drug names that physicians 20 years ago didn't have to remember. And I'd contend that we're probably doing the same thing for our residents in some ways, not always, but in some ways. So we should all say no to the imaginectomy and do what we can to try to hold on to our imaginations. We also should never lose our why. And Matt Katz posted this on Twitter, and I think, I'm not surprised, it probably still gets some likes and hits. So Timothy Chan was talking about how we need to contribute more to fighting cancer than just focusing on radiation therapy. And Matt Katz included this quote from Dr. Hellman that said, be a good person, then a good doctor, then a good oncologist, then a good radiation oncologist, in that order. And chances are you were born a good person, and then you decided to be a doctor. Somewhere along the line, you decided to be an oncologist, and somewhere along the line, you decided to be a radiation oncologist. So you can still be all those other things. You don't have to just be a radiation oncologist. We can do more than just irradiate tumors and tackle problems outside of targeting tumor and normal tissue effects. And I think a lot of us, especially people like, I think a lot of women, people like me, sometimes you feel like someone's got to give you permission to do something out of your scope, and you really don't need permission. You can focus on any problem within those realms and more. Don't believe the hype, in the words of Flava Flav and Chuck D, Public Enemy. One path is not more important than the other. So if you're a basic scientist running a lab, that's awesome. If you're in rural Montana operating a private practice focusing on clinical medicine, that's great too. We don't all have the same abilities, strengths, experiences, and opportunities. You know, I didn't have a lot of the opportunities and mentorship to do things in basic or translational science. You know, I found my own way with the opportunities that were provided to me. And I think that in training, there's a lot of pressure to become something that somebody else may want you to be, maybe a mentor or a chairman. And you really have to stay clear to your own path. And, you know, who are you? You know, what's authentic to you? Who did you used to be? And if you don't know the answers to that question, think about what you're interested in before you decided to be a radiation oncologist or even a doctor. For me, I really wanted to be an author or a reporter. And so a lot of things that I'm doing on social media and writing articles are sort of in line with those initial desires. So if you feel like you've sort of lost your way, think about what it is you wanted to do. And I think that we should all think about making a broader difference with our unique skills, resources, and viewpoint. You know, an example from this tweet is one of my local mentors, Dave Margolis, who's a pediatric oncologist. He's a really huge sports fan. His family owned a parking lot across from the Buck Stadium, so he grew up around a lot of the athletes, and grew up with Craig Counsell, who's one of the managers of the Brewers. So he's just a rabid sports fan, and has gotten involved with our local MAC fund that raises a lot of money for pediatric malignancies. And so he uses his platform between sports and oncology to raise money for cancer, which is really cool. You know, Reshma Jagsi, I think she is one of the brightest minds in radiation oncology right now. And I had the opportunity to spend a little bit of time with her when she was a visiting professor at MCW. You know, this is somebody who was top of her class at Harvard for both undergraduate and medical school. And she's decided to use her intellect. She could do anything she wants and study anything she wants. She has such a brilliant mind. And she's decided to use her intellect to tackle problems in equity. And runs a center at University of Michigan and publishes just incredible papers looking at equity in radiation oncology and beyond. And you know, lastly, of course, you know, we have Dr. Steve Hahn running the FDA now, and it honestly comforts me every night, especially during this COVID crisis, thinking that somebody as brilliant and with such tremendous leadership skills as Dr. Hahn is making some of the most major decisions right now in our government. And so, you know, any of us could do that, and it's really inspiring to see our radiation oncology leaders really at the forefront. So I'll just tell you a little bit about my evolving path in diversity, inclusion, and equity at the intersection of innovation and connection, particularly locally. So just some general definitions. Equity, our institutional definition, is the assurance of conditions for optimal success and opportunity for all people, with particular focus on promoting policies, practices, and cultural messages that eliminate differential negative outcomes for people from historically subordinated groups. And so, equity is traditionally the picture in the middle, where, whereas on the left it's equality, everybody gets the same number of boxes, and on the right and the middle is equity, where everybody gets what they need. And what we're really striving for is that last picture, liberation, where we don't need crutches for people and everybody can see the game without having to stand on a box. Diversity, a lot of people think about diversity in terms of ethnicity and race, but diversity really includes so much more than that: ability, sexual orientation, ageism. And so when we think about diversity, we really want to challenge ourselves to think beyond, gender, ethnicity, and race. And so it's really more than that. And lastly, I think inclusion is the most important piece, but I think it's also the most difficult piece to achieve because it's hard to measure. And that's the co-creation and continual nurturing of a culture in which all people experience respect, belonging, access to opportunity, and influence through the integration of many cultural backgrounds, ideas, perspectives, and approaches to work. An inclusive culture can produce learning, innovation, excellence, and mutual benefit throughout the communities we serve. So we're really all striving for that inclusive excellence. So I think what really got me interested in health disparity work, besides my personal work, is I think that a lot of us, as we go through our career path, it seems like the way to get promoted in radiation oncology, or just the natural progression, is to become a specialist, then a super specialist, then a super ultra specialist. And I found myself working on a talk for a disease that only affected maybe a couple hundred people or less per year in the United States, and advocating for a treatment that didn't even exist yet. So, it was a nice day, and in the summer in Wisconsin, I was working on this talk, and I was just thinking, what am I doing? Why am I working on this talk? It just doesn't seem like it's really going to help a lot of people. And you don't have to look very far in Milwaukee to realize that if we just stopped, innovation, and just applied what we know now to everybody equally, we'd save thousands of lives, probably millions. And so that's definitely the truth in Milwaukee, where there are major health disparities. So the picture on the right, the zip codes that are red have infant mortality rates on par with developing nations, which is just completely inexcusable in the United States, especially because they're located within miles of zip codes that have excellent infant mortality rates. And you can see that the data on the left, the heat map on the left, shows the breast cancer specific mortality rates follow the same pattern. So there are definitely some neighborhoods in Milwaukee that are not receiving the care that they should. So a way to improve health equity is to improve workforce diversity, and the Institute of Medicine, the National Medical Association, the Association of American Medical Colleges, AAMC, and the AMA all endorse increasing workforce diversity as a strategy to improve health equity. And there are several papers that we could talk about to suggest that patient-provider race concordance improves health outcomes, and that in these clinical encounters, patients experience better communication, trust, there's less bias, and patients are more likely to follow these recommendations. So we're not doing that great right now in diversity in medical school. In 2015, 6% of our medical students were Black or African American, and 5% were Hispanic or Latino. And depending on the year, we're sort of right around those percentages at Medical College of Wisconsin. And if we look at our national diversity, in the US currently 13% of our population is African American, and 70% is Hispanic or Latinx. Here in the city of Milwaukee, 40% of our population is African American, and 17% is Hispanic or Latinx. And looking at 2044, minority populations will actually be the majority of the US population due to the largest increase in our Hispanic Latinx population, which is predicted to be 25%. So we have to do a lot now to ensure that we continue to improve diversity, inclusion, and equities, particularly as we look at these changing US demographics. So I've had the honor since last June to lead this team in the Office of Student Inclusion and Diversity. And there's 5 of us that work together. We oversee our pipeline and pathway programs. We oversee programs that run year round and that touch over 100 high school, middle school, and college students to try to improve access for underrepresented minorities to get careers in the health sciences. Another initiative that I'm really passionate about is our inclusion support. We want to make sure that once we bring diverse people to our institution, that they have a good experience. And I think Medical College of Wisconsin is similar to a lot of other medical schools where that's not necessarily happening right now. So we can't just be intentional about improving diversity. We have to be intentional about improving inclusion. And unfortunately, a lot of our underrepresented minority students feel disconnected, unsupported, and disrespected in the medical education environment. And we're doing a lot of things to try to improve that. And we also do a lot with community engagement, working with schools, outside of our formalized program to bring opportunities and spark an interest in underrepresented minorities in our city. I've also been involved in a lot of local advocacy efforts. When ASCO published that paper about sexual and gender community health disparities, one of my residents, Dr. Ross Zeitlin, and I became very motivated to bring LGBTQ cancer disparities to MCW. And so we've had the opportunity to form community engaged partnerships. We've gotten involved with the Tobacco Free Alliance, and we're working really hard to bring a smoke-free environment to our big music festivals and our Milwaukee Pride. And we'll actually be hosting an educational symposium this fall on sexual and gender minority cancer disparities. I've also had the opportunity to get involved in a lot of nonprofit profit organizations in the city as well. So if we look at radiation oncology, and this is data from Kurt DeVille that he published in 2012, radiation oncology ranks near the bottom for representation for women, African Americans, and Hispanics. So as you see this sort of transition in percentages, so if you focus on the green bars, the percentage of African Americans in the US Census, about 12.6%. And as we go from medical school graduates, radiation oncology applicants, residency, faculty, and beyond, we can see that number gets smaller and smaller. It's the same for women. We go from 50% of women in the US Census to about 24% in radiation oncology faculty. And we can see that over time from the data from Christina Chapman, we can see that this isn't really improving over time, particularly for our minority groups. So at Astro has a committee, the Committee for Health Equity, Diversity, Inclusion, or CHEDI, and there you can volunteer. The deadline is actually today. We're limited to 40 members and pretty strict about that from Astro staff and leadership. So if you're interested in the committee and you don't get on the committee, it's only because we, on a given year there might be 10 openings and we, easily get 40 plus applications. And so sometimes it takes a couple of tries to get in. It helps to reach out to one of us personally. It also helps to write a compelling narrative. It also helps, I think one of the criteria that they make us look at is they make us look at the number of other committees that people are involved in. So if you're involved in a number of other committees, we're supposed to take people that aren't involved in other committees. We have 3 main working groups: the Workforce Diversity Group that Christina Woodhouse oversees with Kurt DeVille. We have our Education Working Group that Fumiko Chino and Malcolm Mattis oversee with the help of Geeta Suneja. And we have our Advocacy Working Group that Rosalind Morel works on, and I help her with that. And Karen Winkfield's technically not on our committee anymore, but she's really been the heart and soul of our committee, has been on the committee for over a decade and has really helped put us on the map. So one of our big projects is the Aster Minority Summer Fellowship. It's our flagship program. Since 2010, it's an 8-week summer exposure experience. We have a preference for MS1 and 2. Participants submit an Astro abstract and attend an annual meeting and are assigned an Astro committee for an Astro Chetty liaison. This is going to be published soon, but of all the prior participants, 70% of them have entered radiation oncology, and those who have decided to enter radiation oncology, we have a 100% match rate. So we have anywhere from 2 to 3 positions per year, and this year we have the most we've ever had. We have 4 positions. Had I think about 10 to 12 applications this year, and we just went through our review process, and those students that were chosen will be notified soon. So it's a really fantastic program. As you know, as most of you know on the call, since you're probably all active on Twitter, there has been a lot of concern about the Astro leadership not reflecting the radiation oncology workforce. And that's improved with the most recent board. I think we went from 2 women to 4 women, but we all know that we have a lot of work to do. And this isn't lost on Astro. Diversity inclusion is listed as a core value. Honestly, there doesn't seem to be a lot of strategy behind it other than what our committee is doing, but we're trying to engage with leadership to get some strategy around diversity and inclusion and equity within the organization. A new program that a lot of you might not know about is the Astro Pipeline Protege program. There was a pilot year that was just concluded last year, and it's an inclusive career development program. The hope is to diversify Astro's councils and future leaders. And to be eligible, you just have to be a board certified radiation oncologist or a medical physicist. There's a preference for individuals who are 5 years post-training. We want people to sort of get beyond sort of those new issues that you have from when you're a junior faculty member and sort of have an established direction in your career. And you just need a demonstrated interest in diversity, inclusion, health equity, or disparities. You do not need to be an underrepresented minority in medicine to be eligible. So this past year was a pilot year. There were 3 proteges aligned with 3 councils: education, science, and government relations. And those individuals are assigned a mentor, complete a council project, and have access to leadership. So that's going to be announced, I think, soon again. And so we'll be looking for 3 new proteges for the first non-pilot year. Additionally, Chetty has had the opportunity to contribute sessions to the annual meeting. And this past year, we had 2 sessions. One was Pathways for Recruiting and Retaining Women and Underrepresented Minorities, Minority Clinicians and Physician Scientists in the Radiation Oncology Workforce. And we have a paper that summarizes the findings of that symposium that's going to be published soon, Advances in Radiation Oncology. And we also had a session on improving the clinical treatment of vulnerable populations in radiation oncology, Latinx, African American, Native American, and gender and sexual minority communities. And we have a paper on that symposium coming out in Advances as well soon. One of our newest programs is the Aspiring Scientists and Physicians program, the ASP program. And this is a new program that was launched last year at Astro to expose pre-medical underrepresented minorities to the field of radiation oncology at the host city during the Astro convention. And so this past year, we had a partnership with University of Illinois Chicago and University of Chicago, and students came for a half-day experience with presentations from Astro members, panels, and a tour of the exhibit hall. Astro and Chetty leaders were involved with that, as well as Minority Summer Fellowship winners, and we'll be involving some of the Science Council memberships in this program. So we're really excited to bring it to Miami, hopefully this year. So why do we want to do this? The business case has been made. You can read reports from McKinsey and other areas. Diverse teams perform better. And also, I think, we have a moral imperative to spread our privilege to those who may not have as much privilege. And as I discussed before, we know that it results in better patient care. So there are some major challenges to inclusion, particularly in radiation oncology and beyond. There's a lack of minority role models in medicine. People say you can't be what you can't see. And so we really need more minority role models in the field. It's difficult for people to adjust to the culture of medicine, especially if they come from a background with without a lot of family members in medicine. There's mistreatment, microaggressions, isolation and marginalization, especially if you don't see a lot of other people like you at your school. Racial biases, prejudice, discrimination, this still happens. There's stereotype threat, which is a phenomenon where, for example, if you go into a test and there's a stereotype that you might not be as intelligent or as competitive as the majority group, that it can actually affect your performance on the exam. Imposter syndrome, code switching, which is something that a lot of people from minority groups have to do, where they have to change the way that they talk or act to fit in with the majority culture. There's the minority tax, people from minority backgrounds having to do all this extra work, this minority work that people from majority populations don't have to do. And there's racial battle fatigue. It just gets tired to have to continue to fight the same fight. So what are ways that you can help? A lot of people ask that. And I think that the number one thing that you can do is recognize your own biases. And we all have them. A quick way to check for that is the Harvard Implicit Association test, which it could be its own talk on its own, talking about whether or not that test is really valid. But one of the things that I thought was really interesting, Quinn Capers, who was the Dean of Admissions at Ohio State University, he's now the Vice Dean of Faculty Affairs. When he was the Dean of Admissions, he required his entire admissions committee to do the Harvard Implicit Association test, and he had them all do the black-white test and the male-female test. And so in the male-female test, they show you pictures of women either like holding a baby or in a boardroom. And there was, so for the women that took the test, literally 100% of the women who took the test were biased against working women. So it's not to say that those were bad women. It's just to say that, we all have biases. We need to recognize them so we can mitigate them. And immediate ways you could mitigate your biases is, think about it when you write letters of recommendation or student resident evaluations. There's some great data that's come out, particularly from UCSF, that shows that letter writers or evaluation writers will pick different verbs or adjectives to describe men versus men versus women, and minorities versus non-minority individuals, where you might pick more, like personality traits for women and more skill-based traits for men. So, think about that. And there's lots of tools that you can use to sort of help guide the language that you use when you write your letters or evaluations. And lastly, and it sounds kind of like silly or overly simplistic to say this, but professionally be an ally, mentor, sponsor, champion for somebody different than you. I really go out of my way to try to mentor a lot of not just women, but men, in addition, minorities and non-minorities, to encourage people to go into equity. And I think that it really needs to not just be a professional thing, it really needs to extend to your personal life. So, going out of your way to seek out diverse friendships and experience, I think can also help you develop your diversity, inclusion, and equity viewpoint. And I also think that it's really important to be an equity ally. So allies are individuals from dominant social groups through their support and of non-dominant groups actively work toward the eradication of prejudicial practices they witness in both their personal and professional lives. So again, it can't just stop at personal, it can't just stop at professional, it really needs to be in both places. Allies are motivated to take action at the interpersonal institutional levels by actively promoting the rights of the oppressed. It's painful to become an ally, and I've been through a lot of workshops and living this and doing this, and every day I learn something internally painful about myself and how I can be a better advocate or ally. And I think that in addition to, you really want to advocate for equity for all. So not just groups that you represent, but groups that other people represent, because to achieve equity, it's not just one group that needs equity. It's really a mission for everybody. So I wanted to end with a couple of future predictions. And I think my number one prediction is expect the uncertain. There's a lot of talk on Twitter and elsewhere about the job market. Nobody knows what's going to happen. I mean, who would have predicted, a year ago that we would be in this mess with the pandemic? And lastly, people don't talk about it as much, but disruptive technologies could spark up at any time. And so to solve this, I think it's really important to keep a growth mindset. We have to continue evolving. We have to continue growing because the world that we're living in is not a static vacuum. We all need to think about broadening our scope and impact. And in addition to that, I think that if you focus on what gives you meaning in life, in some ways, the rest of this stuff, all this uncertainty won't matter because you're doing what gives you the most meaning. The second one is, in this uncertain environment, I think the days of being handed, a beautiful private practice or even in academics of being handed leadership of a disease site, those opportunities might not be there anymore. So you really need to make your own luck. And the way to do that, I think, in radiation oncology, we're all going to have to keep hustling, putting ourselves out there to seek opportunity. In addition to that, strive for excellence, keep working hard, doing the best work that you can, and being a connector, connecting different disciplines to come up with new ideas to do things. And lastly, there's going to be exponentially increasing technology, and growth is going to force us to further specialize, and we need to rebel. Do not surrender your imagination and creativity, as Dr. Scott said. Always remember your personal why and have the courage to be your authentic self. And once you figure that out for yourself, you need to shine your brightest because that's who you truly are. And it also gives permission for others to shine bright and make the difference that they want to make as well. So that's the end of my talk. So I wanted to thank again Dr. Kavanaugh, Dr. Doak, Dr. Scott, the University of Colorado for inviting me to speak with all of you tonight.